I treated him like trash until I realized he owned the Rolls Royce I was leaning on. It sounds dramatic when I say it like that, but the lobby that morning made it easy to be dramatic. Floor-to-ceiling glass, marble so pale that hurt your eyes, brass fixtures polished until they could mirror a face back at you with flattering light. I had my coat draped over my arm, my heels planted in a way that said I had somewhere better to go than the conversation in front of the reception desk. The Rolls Royce sat idling at the curb, with its nose tucked under the porte-cochere, black lacquer swallowing the morning. I was leaning against it the way someone leans against money, not careless, but confident enough that the object under your hand seems like an extension of yourself. That was me then, careful with image, careless with people. He walked in like someone who knew exactly where he was and was entirely certain nobody else would notice. He was small-framed, sleeves fraying at the cuff, jacket that had seen better decades hung on shoulders that didn't bother to hide the fact they had carried a life. In his hands he carried a folded photograph. Not a glossy print, not a framed piece, just a smudge of paper folded twice, the kind of thing you hold because it's the only thing between you and the weight of a memory. "Can I help you?" Larissa asked from behind the glass of the reception desk, in that tone all receptionists learn where they are being hospitable and defensive at the same time. He unfolded the photograph like this was a ceremony. "I need to speak with someone in leadership," he said. His voice had a patient edge, the kind of patience that has nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with endurance. "It's about a promise." We both heard the word promise and translated it. In our office, promise was a portfolio metric, a pipeline forecast, a shareholder projection. We did not translate it into the names of people or the small mercies that keep an institution breathing. "I'll get security," Larissa offered, posture stiffening. "There's no need for that," he said quietly. "I'll wait." That was the first moment I decided he'd be a nuisance. Not because he was dangerous, he wasn't, because he was inconvenient. I had a client meeting in 30 minutes. I had prepared notes that I had memorized until they felt like my own blood. I had a 5-minute elevation speech that was more practice than prayer. People who waited in our lobby without appointments were delays, and delays cost us time, and time was the thing we measured above all else. "He doesn't belong here," Camila said softly beside me. She had the sort of kindness that made her a perfect assistant, efficient, quietly observant, and prone to doing the right thing more often than not. She had smiled at him earlier when he'd helped pick up a stack of envelopes that had fallen from the courier's dolly. That small kindness irritated me. "He's panhandling," someone else murmured. Voices folded into the room. Marcio's low laugh, Roberto shaking his head. "We have rituals. We have statuses. You are either in the meeting or you are waiting to be rescheduled. There is a place for everyone, and he had placed himself in the wrong one." I stepped forward. "Sir, I can tell you where to sit if you plan on waiting. There's a coffee shop 2 blocks over." He looked at me with a softness that felt, at the time, indulgent. "I'm asking to speak with the people who remember the promise," he said. The words should have made me curious. Instead, they made me impatient. "We don't do walk-ins. If you have something important, you can leave it with reception. We'll forward it." He folded the photograph away then, as though closing a history book that's been read too many times. "My name is Benedito." He said it without fanfare. In my head, I already had him filed. Old, harmless, someone by whose name the word obligation would likely be attached. An unpleasant memory for the receptionist, rather than a strategic risk. We had procedures for people like that. We had polite handoffs to security. We had a culture that preferred moving bodies to addressing reasons. "Tell security to take his details," I said. "We won't accept unscheduled meetings." Larissa nodded, her hand hovering over the phone. Camila hesitated. I saw the small movement in her chest, an intake that could have become a question, a protest. It died in the polite place between her mouth and mine. He left. He came back the next day, and the next. You get used to people disappearing. People apply for this job, they get hired, they get burned out, or they move to a rival. Clients walk in and leave with new contracts or new problems. This man didn't vanish. He arranged himself like a pebble that refuses to be kicked down the path. Each time he returned, he folded the same photograph and sat in the same plastic chair by the ficus. He did not speak loudly. He did not make a scene. He asked the same question. "May I speak with someone in leadership? It's about a promise." His patience threw us off. We were not designed for it. Our solutions were immediate. Ask him to leave, call the security desk, make a note. But bureaucracies are good at noise. They are terrible at listening. On the 3rd day, I watched him from the corner of my eye. I was leaning against the Rolls Royce again. Habit or hubris, I couldn't tell which. The car's finish reflected the lobby like a dark pond. I could see people as shapes and edges. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder. Client brief, 9 a.m. Beating expectations starts at 8:59. There was a hum in the building that we mistook for life.
the low-level commotion of an institution that believes it runs the world. Camila was at the desk, sorting mail. He helped Joaquim, she said to me quietly, indicating the delivery man who had come in to drop some packages. Joaquim had been here 20 years and knew everyone.
He had dropped a stack of boxes and cursed under his breath. Benedito had simply stepped over and arranged them, steady and unhurried. "That's all he does?" I asked, feeling the annoyance float back up. The truth is, I wanted him to be less emphatic, less inconvenient. I wanted him to be exactly what we had decided homeless people are, visible and ignorable. "He held the door for Mrs. Alvarez when she huffed in with her oxygen bag," Camila said. "He refused a coffee when Larissa offered him one. He said he couldn't stay long because he had a promise to keep." Promise to whom? I wondered. Promises meant obligations. Obligations meant someone else was to blame for whatever mess he carried. I told myself I was being practical. Leadership must be protected from distractions. The company's reputation, our margins, the client's perception, these were the ledger lines that mattered. That afternoon, our management team assembled like a small court. Roberto, Leonardo, Marcio, 3 executives who wore convenience and cruelty like a single coat. They leaned over coffee and agreed in professional tones that the man posed a risk. "He could be a litigator," Roberto said. "He could have an agenda. We can't have that in the lobby." "We're more efficient if we don't let emotion get in the way," Marcio said. He said it with the smugness of someone who confuses heartlessness for objectivity. He did not see the irony that we were discussing getting in the way while planning to have someone forcibly removed. "Call security," Leonardo suggested. "Escort him out. If he returns, fine, ban him from the property." I remember nodding because nodding is easier than thinking. And not long after, a quietly rehearsed thing took place. 2 security officers approached Benedito while he was rearranging a pile of brochures, the photograph peeking from his hand. One of them said the words we all use to make action feel legal. "Sir, I have to ask you to leave the premises." He smiled. It wasn't the smile you give a friend. It was the smile you give to the rain when you forgot your umbrella. "Of course," he said. "I understand." As they escorted him out, the receptionist whispered that some client had seen the commotion. A small ripple of embarrassment passed across the faces in the lobby, the kind that happens when a mirror starts to show you an angle you didn't know existed. We repaired faces like professional craftsmen. We did not repair the cause. I told myself then that there would be no consequences for our coldness, that we were keeping a building safe, that the economy we kept running was sterile but effective. I had my meeting and I closed the deal. I heard the numbers clicked into place. I tasted victory. This success tasted like lacquered wood and the inside of a leather briefcase, expensive and thin. But a week later he returned. I found myself watching him again from behind the glass doors because habit had become curiosity and curiosity had become unease. The folded photograph was damp now, as if it had been held while the holder cried. He asked to speak with someone in leadership, and Larissa's finger hovered over the phone. Camila's fingers hovered over her keyboard. We were a theater of intervention, waiting for the stage directions to snap into place. This time he did something different. He approached the receptionist not with the passive patience of someone waiting to be scheduled, but with a small, quiet authority that didn't belong to our building and yet carried a peculiar rightness to it. He tapped his chest. "My name is Benedito Silva Andrade," he said. "I used to be here." For a moment it felt like a joke. "Used to be here how?" Larissa asked. He unfolded the photograph and showed us. It was a company event from decades before. Ribbon cutting, dust motes, a woman in a nurse's uniform standing beside a younger man with his arm around her. The banner behind them had the old company name, the logo slightly different, fonts that now looked antique. "That's Helena," he said, tapping the picture. "She worked as a volunteer in the clinic next door. She made me promise something before she died. I need to speak with someone about the promise." The photograph felt like contraband in our modern lobby. The nurses and volunteers of old were soft things to those who transacted mergers and hired consultants. We did not honor sentimental obligations. We optimized. "Security will have to escort you again," Roberto said, the sentence falling like a verdict. He nodded. "That's fine," he said.
But if I leave and I do not get an answer, then the promise continues to be in danger. The word danger slipped into the conversation oddly. We are averse to danger when it threatens our balance sheets. We are tolerant of danger when it is someone else's story. He'll do a story later, Marcio shrugged. We have to show we maintain order. Order in our vocabulary equaled absence of embarrassment. That week, small things started to ripple in ways that made me uncomfortable. Cafeteria tables filled with executives discussing the idiot who kept returning. Somebody posted a subtle meme in the company chat about vigilant trespass prevention and tagged security. A junior associate wrote to Human Resources, gently. Perhaps there is a way to reach him? HR replied with protocol attachments, a tidy paper trail. And still he came back. One morning I saw him standing at the corner of my building, talking quietly to Joachim, the delivery man. They were laughing about something small, an old joke about stamps, I think. Benedito had a way of making space for the small things, not to celebrate them, but to acknowledge them. Later that morning, Camila said she'd seen him press his palm to the photograph and murmur a name.
She said it with a softness that made me think of funerals, of rooms smelling faintly of lilies. Why does he do this? I asked. The question contained so much I was trying not to admit. Curiosity, judgment, the fear of being made to feel small in a world where my stature was measured in square footage. Because he promised someone? Camila offered, hedging. Did someone die? Larissa asked, eyes rimmed with 2 days of not enough sleep. Yes, Camila said. She was a nurse. She ran programs. She used to come around here often. People still remember her in some departments. He says he needs to know whether the company still keeps its promises. Promises again. It started to sound like a test. I laughed then, a quick, dismissive sound. A test, I said. Who does he think he is? Some sort of morality inspector? We run a business. We did run a business. We also had a brand to protect. We had key clients who disliked being delayed. We had investors whose patience lasted about as long as an earnings call. In our code, sentiment was a liability. That afternoon, in a management meeting that had nothing to do with Benedito and everything to do with the quarter, someone used his name as an insult. We can't be run by sentiment, Roberta said. People like him would collapse our processes. It would be humiliating for him to keep coming back, Marcio added with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. We laughed. It was small and sharp and felt like air escaping a balloon. Later, walking back to my car, I noticed the Rolls Royce again. It had been moved to the side of the street and someone had propped a glossy brochure on the hood. The sunlight caught it like a stage light. I thought of the photograph tucked in Benedito's pocket, damp and folded. I thought of Elena's name. She had worked in a clinic, they said. She had volunteered with patients who couldn't pay. She had been loved. I told myself she was irrelevant to our margins. I bounced my phone and checked an email, and the world turned smooth again. There was a client presentation scheduled in the auditorium 3 days later. Dr. Enrique Marias was flying in from Sao Paulo. He was a high-profile businessman, the kind of client you put at the center of a company's calendar. He liked things run in a particular way. He expected precision. I had prepared for him. It had my fingerprints on it. That morning, the operations team sent a terse message to security. Manage the lobby, no disturbances. It arrived with a few checkboxes. Monitor the entrance, keep people at reception, escort trespassers off-site. The memo had a line in bold. Prioritize client experience. When I walked in, the lobby felt like a body preparing for a race. Chairs were straightened. People were told to smile and then told to relax their smiles so they didn't look desperate. There is a choreography to such days. Everyone knows their mark and their cue. Benedito was there.
He sat in the corner, not looking like an intruder, but like a man who belonged to an older narrative. The photograph had been placed on his knee. He kept folding and unfolding it. People avoided his gaze, the way you avoid stepping on cracked pavement. I felt a complicated pinch, an irritation like a tight shoe. Tell security he can't stay, I heard Leonardo say to Larissa, mouth set in the line he thought made him look resolute. We can't have distractions. He's been here every day, Larissa whispered. He keeps saying he needs to speak about a promise. Then he can speak with the person who handles legacy matters, Roberto suggested. Not leadership, not today. They were trying to be careful. They were trying to be far-sighted, the way people who want to be righteous without inconveniencing themselves try to be careful. I walked past Benedito on my way to the elevator. My reflection in the mirrored wall looked smooth, practiced. He caught my eye and lifted his chin, a gesture less of challenge than of recognition. For a beat, I felt the fullness of a question press against the ribs of my confidence. What would you do if you were told that the company you helped build had forgotten the soul it once had? I told myself I would act with reason. That afternoon, the CEO's office buzzed. People in the corridors whispered about optics. People who had never spoken to one another exchanged looks that meant, make the situation small. We can't let it expand. We can't let a promise become a scandal. It was in that atmosphere that Camila came to me with a note. He left this in the mailroom, she said, handing me a small envelope with brittle edges. My name was not on it. The envelope had no return address. Inside was a page, written in a hand that had learned not to hurry. The note said plainly, "My wife asked me to see if the place that bears her name still keeps its promises." It was not a threat. It was not even a plea. It was a report, like the weather. It forced me, in a way I could not yet name, to reckon with a history I had inherited without acknowledgement. Beneath the note, a line in smaller script read, "If not, then things will change." That one line made the room tilt. We scheduled a short meeting, an operational buffer to decide on how to proceed with a long-term trespasser. We would call security and have him removed. We would protect our client. We were all competent people in our assigned roles. But beneath the memos and bullet points, there was a physical tension, like the taut cable of a bridge. People were afraid of something they couldn't name. I was afraid of being publicly called to account for my small cruelties. I felt a heat behind my eyes when I thought about the photograph. I told myself I cared about dignity. Saying it let me sleep. Acting on it required inconvenience. That night I dreamed of the Rolls Royce. It was empty and polished, the doors open to a luxury I had never earned.
Inside, there were no people, only echoes. I woke with my palms cold and a small spasm of shame that was more appetizing than painful. I had, after all, a job to do. In the days that followed, Benedito's visits multiplied in their quiet persistence. He began speaking to people in departments I didn't frequent. He listened to the cafeteria woman tell a story about her son, and then offered a memory from his own life that made her eyes water. He left flowers on the grave of a former seamstress, Camilla told me, someone who had mended suits for executives long retired. Stories accumulate in institutions like lint under a desk. We sweep them up and put them in neat piles. He did not ask for accolades. He left a small blue envelope on my desk one morning, marked for leadership. Inside were 2 sheets. The front had a list of names, people who had worked here for decades and left quietly without bouquets or acknowledgments. The second was a short paragraph about a nurse named Alina, who used to sew an extra blanket into a patient care bag at night when no one was looking. "A promise," he wrote on the second page. "If you remember her, you will remember why you built this place. If you forget, then we will remember for you." The words were plain. They were also a mirror. I tossed the envelope into my bag like a hot potato. I told myself it was manipulative. I told myself the man was seeking attention. The rationalizations were fast, practiced. You say cruel things to yourself to keep the world in ordered columns. We had a board meeting in a week. Dr. Henrique was confirmed. The auditorium was booked. Catering had been selected. The company's public face was polishing itself for display. I sat in meetings and watched people rehearse smiling. In the places between diagrams and budgets, there were conversations about message control, stakeholder perception, brand risk. There was no conversation about the list of names and the small print about Helena. When someone suggested we deal with Benedito quietly, off-site, Marcio said, with a kind of satisfied cruelty, "Let's make sure the lesson is not forgotten by him. If he keeps returning, perhaps he needs to be taught boundaries." It was one of those phrases that, when spoken aloud, makes people feel their righteousness. Boundaries sounded meat. It sounded like governance. It sounded like something I could support. I did. I called security and asked them to be discreet. I approved their plan. There is a particular morality to discretion. You can do ugly things if you swaddle them in efficiency. That night, I replayed the decisions in my head like an exercise in justification. I told myself the company had a right to protect its clients. I told myself I wasn't cruel, only pragmatic. I told myself that compassion was a luxury that could be budgeted. On the morning of the presentation, the atmosphere was taut. Ceiling tiles peeled back to let light in like attention.
We had made a plan. Security would approach, ask him to leave. If he resisted, they would remove him. That word, remove, felt small in the meeting notes and monstrous in its implications. I found myself standing at the edge of the lobby before the flurry. I watched Benedito fold the photograph. He looked fragile and complete at once. The photograph, when he unfolded it, seemed to make him ache and be steady in the same breath. It was an intimacy I couldn't afford. A chauffeur in a dark suit opened the driver's side door of the Rolls Royce and helped someone into the rear seat. The car gleamed as if it had been made precisely to hold beauty under glass. I had been leaning on it earlier in the week and called it a prop of my success. I had used its gravity like a costume. Now, watching the scene unfold, a sliver of rationalization cracked. "He's not touched anything," Camila whispered. "He's just sat there." It was true. He had been a still point. He had been, in all respects, quiet. The first security guard approached him with smiles that had been practiced on other objects. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to leave." He stood slowly, folding the photograph with hands that had the same careful gesture my grandmother used when folding tea towels. "I will leave," he said, "but I will wait until I can speak to someone about the promise." They led him a few steps toward the doors. A murmur rose in the lobby. That was where it might have stayed. An incident, a little flare that would warn the rest of the building to be vigilant. But there was a client waiting. Dr. Henrique was due. The operations team called for order. Voices hardened. Someone in the crowd half laughed at the inconvenience, and someone else clapped their hands together as if to end a prayer. I had made the call. I had agreed with it. I had organized the choreography. I was, by all counts, the kind of person who made difficult decisions. And yet, as I watched Benedito being guided out, the photograph fell from his pocket and swooped, like a bird, onto the marble. It lay there on the floor, open to a picture of a nurse kneeling with a child and laughing like the weight of the world had become suddenly smaller. 100 eyes looked at it. Mine poignantly did. For a moment, nothing happened. Then someone bent down and picked it up. The guard's hand hovered. Benedito's eyes never left the picture. He moved as if he had time for patience and sorrow, and for something else I could not name. "Please," he said, stopping them with the quiet of someone who knows timing matters more than volume. "Before you take me away, can you tell Mrs. Alvarez that we had a meeting? Tell her I visited, and that I remember." The lobby heard the simple request like a bell. A woman with an oxygen bag froze. Camila's face changed colors. "We have an institutional reflex to grant miscellaneous decency when it doesn't cost us anything."
But to give up a day's schedule, a client's first impression, the feeling of control, that is where tests happen. That is where people reveal their measure. I remember the exact second I decided to act. Not because I wanted to help him, but because I felt the camera of shame pointing at my chest. I wanted to avoid discomfort. Ego can move someone as fast as compassion if the motivation looks the same. "Take him out," I said, the order sliding off my tongue like everyone else's. I don't know if I thought in that moment I was protecting the company or protecting myself. He surrendered without violence. He did not resist. He walked with the dignity of someone who knows the cost of a promise. When he reached the glass doors, he paused, and I noticed then, with a kind of tight internal surprise, that the driver of the Rolls Royce across the street was watching him. The car's window shimmered, and for an instant I imagined the owner inside measuring how close dignity had come to being flushed away. As they opened the doors and escorted him out, someone from the front desk called out, "Sir, we have a policy." He turned, the photograph still in his hand. He raised it slightly toward us, like a benediction or a question. "You all built something once," he said, almost to the air. "Did you forget why?" It landed in the lobby like a pebble dropped into still water. Ripples moved through the room. In the human body of the office, something that had been still, something that used to be alive, stirred. We let him go. We went into the auditorium and smiled at Dr. Enrique as if we had learned nothing. We delivered a presentation so slick it had edges. The numbers climbed. We left the room feeling as if we'd saved a market share and not a soul. That night, the photograph was everywhere in my thoughts. I folded and unfolded it in the privacy of my mind. I thought of the nurse, Helena, and the promise. I thought of the Rolls Royce parked outside, the car I had leaned on like an emblem of the world I thought I owned. I told myself we had done the right thing. I told myself the company must be kept secure. And yet, beneath those tidy sentences, something else was growing, slow and insistent, like a bruise forming. I am telling this story now because it matters that I say what I did. I can remember precisely how the leather of the Rolls Royce had felt under my hand that morning, cool and dismissive. I can remember my laugh in boardrooms when the issues of the lobby were brought up, my voice a small blade. I can remember Camilla's face when she asked me, almost pleading, if we couldn't hear him. A nuisance, I had said. We have to be efficient. The days after the presentation were a blur of success and small, inadmissible discomfort. Someone in marketing began to complain that the socials were picking up a sympathetic thread about the old man in the lobby. Someone else told me we were being trolled.
We made a media statement about protecting client experience while maintaining respect for all visitors. Meanwhile, Benedito remained present in whispers and gestures. He met Joachim for coffee one Saturday at the church across the street and spoke to the volunteer nurses. He returned an envelope into the hands of a former seamstress who had sat unnoticed in the atrium, and the seamstress wept like a thing that had been waiting for permission. I began to receive notes from employees who had been in positions of service decades before. They told me that Elena's name still mattered in low-traffic corners of the company, that she used to insist executives spend time on the floor every quarter, that she stitched into our culture a sense of duty. The emails were small and half-laced with bitterness. I read them and felt a churning that had nothing to do with profit and everything to do with a mirror I had refused to look into. One evening, after most had gone home, Camila found me in the stairwell. "You can't stay on autopilot," she said. Her voice was quiet but direct. "This man isn't looking to embarrass you. He is holding a mirror." She looked at me like someone daring me to be bigger than my defensiveness. "If he keeps coming, people will keep watching who we really are." I wanted to reply that I had no time for morality plays. I wanted to tell her that the company is the company. But there, in the stairwell, my own reflection in the emergency exit glass looked small and tired. I had leaned on that Rolls Royce as if the car's sheen could be grafted to me. I had invested in a persona, and suddenly the persona felt brittle. "Let's keep it professional," I said instead. It was a sentence that had the calculated cruelty of habit. I said it because it felt safe. That night, Benedito left a parcel at Camila's desk. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a small metal key fob with an old company emblem on it. There was no explanation, just a scrap of paper with one word: remember. I kept the key fob in my drawer for days, looking at its cool weight and feeling more like a thief than a steward. The object was useless and dangerous. It implied a history that was inconvenient for my narrative of the present. The week went on. We prepared for the next big investor check-in. I rehearsed smiling while people threw numbers at me like darts. Meanwhile, Benedito kept appearing in the margins of our day. A quiet conversation, a left-behind envelope, a name called with respect by a retiree who now worked part-time in the archive. And the Rolls Royce kept appearing at the curb. It is strange to build a moral panic out of courtesy. It is stranger still to discover that the panic comes not from some external threat, but from a man who insists the institution remember what it once claimed to be. I knew, somewhere under the adrenaline of the week, that a choice was accumulating. The company could continue to be efficient and lose a certain human substrate, or it could acknowledge the names and the narrative it had been built upon and risk the unquantifiable. Both options had stakes that were unappealing. On a Wednesday, as the lobby filled with a particular kind of nervous electricity, clients in suits, investors with notepads, an intern trying to appear unruffled, Benedito arrived, and the sound in the room changed. It wasn't that he was loud or dramatic. He simply sat down and folded his photograph and waited. People stared. Voices went through their practiced motions. Security rehearsed its quiet approach. I found my throat dry in a way that made me aware of every thinness in the life I had cut for myself. I stood near the elevators, feeling the heat of 1,000 small, calculated decisions. The auditorium down the hall hummed with expected applause, the kind that dries the mouth. The company was at its most polished, and I felt like a thief who had been called on in the middle of a job. Someone in the crowd said meekly, "He just wants to be heard." The word heard hung there like a prayer. My phone buzzed with a calendar alert. Meeting with Dr. Henrique, 2 p.m., build trust. The words looked brittle and childish. I thought of the nurse in the photograph. I thought of the Rolls Royce outside, its door opening and closing like a heartbeat. Then the lobby erupted in a small, brutal choreography. Security approached. People moved like actors hitting cues. Someone dropped a cup. A child of a client walked in with a balloon. The world made a sound like a rope stretching. I walked forward. I don't remember deciding to be the one to lead the way. One moment I felt like water in a glass,
and the next I was steering a current. I saw Camila's eyes on mine, questioning, pleading. I saw Benedito's photograph open on his knee like an offering. I saw the Rolls Royce sitting at the curb, glossy and arrogant as a challenge. My hand closed on the back of a chair. "Make sure this is handled," I ordered, and yet the tone of it had a tremor I couldn't place. It was a command and a plea at once. They began to approach him. That is where the story opens into its next hinge. The audience was small and tight. The stakes were larger than the lobby. I had agreed to the plan. I had led the call. I had prepared the team. Yet as the procedure began, something in me unspooled and made a sound like a pocket tearing. I watched Benedito fold the photograph carefully, then looked up at me with a face that held a memory I could not afford. In that glance, I saw the name of the woman in the picture, the name that had been whispered by half-forgotten colleagues and by older employees who still remembered the early days, Helena. I felt the moral composition of the room tilt.
I felt the texture of what we were doing, what I had ordered, become visible in a way it hadn't when wrapped in memos and talking points. And the moment the security guard reached for him, Camila grabbed my sleeve and whispered in my ear, "Please." Her hand was small and earnest. In her grip, there was the sort of humility that had always made me a little uncomfortable, because it asked things of me I hadn't prepared to give. The man with the cup of coffee who had been 2 rows back looked embarrassed at the volume of his own breath. Camila stood rooted where she was. Larissa's fingers lay flat on the desk, like a child's on a piano when they don't know what song to begin. Then, like a small machine remembering its function, a man from outside the cordon curb walked up, his suit immaculate, his shoes the kind of shoes made in a factory that stamped perfection into leather. He spoke directly to Benedito, and the sound of his voice cracked something open. "Mr. Andrade," he said, and something about the respect in his tone made the word land like a key in a lock. The driver across the street, who until that moment had been an anonymous accessory to the car, lifted his phone toward Benedito and said, almost apologetically, "Sir, my apologies. The owner is waiting." The lobby translated that for us slower than I would have liked. The Rolls Royce's presence, which I had used as a costume of success, suddenly reoriented itself as evidence. A registration number, a discreet badge on the fob, a chauffeur's familiarity, little details that didn't fit with my tidy prejudices. The small key fob that had clinked on the marble was a paper trail in metal, an old emblem, the name that matched the founder we had half heard about in induction slides. "Mr. Andrade," the guard said, and the echo of the name made the room rearrange itself. It was not a title he offered like something to place on a business card. It was an anchor. For a moment, the lobby breathed in a way I had never heard it breathe before. Then the thing I had set in motion found its full disastrous shape. My mouth still had the taste of argument, of every rationalization I'd rehearsed. The memos sat in neat columns in my head. Safety, I thought. Client experience. Those words felt like shields until my hands began to remember the feel of cold water. I had not planned to be the instrument of humiliation. Yet when Leonardo stepped forward with his tidy, corporate certainty and said to the guards, "Make sure he isn't disruptive," something in me snapped. It was as if all the small cruelties, my jokes, the nods, the quiet tidyings of people into categories, turned into momentum. Momentum is persuasive because it absolves you of decision. I remember stepping forward, my palms tightening on the back of a chair. I remember the exact tilt of my chin that makes people obey without a conscience checking in. "Make it clear," I said, the words hard and public. "We can't have a scene in front of our clients." The guard moved. There was a practiced gentleness in his touch. He reached for Benedito's sleeve to escort him out. Benedito did not resist. He looked at the photograph as if he were reading from it. Then something else happened. A woman, one of the catering staff, a young temporary hired for the event, screamed when a tray was bumped. A waitress's nervous step sent a tray rocking. The sudden flurry made a bucket, meant for spilled drinks and emergency cleanup, tip. I saw, in a motion that has haunted me, a cascade of water. It arced, and then all at once the arc had a target. I don't know anymore if I meant to aim it. What I know is that my body, trained to win and to protect the image of winning, made a decision faster than my heart could protest. The bucket came down, and a column of cold water hit Benedito, soaking him, saturating the photograph until the ink blurred at the edges. The room inhaled as one organism. Time did the strange thing it does when a private shame becomes public. It slowed and it compressed.
The water streamed down his face. His soaked sleeves clung to lean arms. He stood there, dripping, the wet of it glinting on the marble floor. Some people laughed first, the nervous, brittle kind of laugh you hear when someone else builds something that forces you to notice your part in it. Others made noises like someone clearing their throat to speak, but what came out of most mouths was silence. I expected anger, then panic, then a scramble. I had intended the action to be a demonstration, a boundary enforced. I had not imagined the odd, devastating stillness of the man I had doused. Benedito looked at me, and as the wire dripped from the photograph and pooled at his feet, he smiled in a way that was almost reverent. "Thank you," he said quietly. I needed to know. The words landed like a bell in a quiet church. For a beat that stayed in me, the sound of them was louder than the sound of the splash. My cheeks burned. My first thought was a child's. Be smaller. Hide. But there was nowhere to put the shame itched into my skin. The room watched me, a woman who had been the motion that made a man wet in the name of order. I had been leaning on a car outside, and something in the solidity of the metal had convinced me I could hold up anything. Now I realized how small a prop could make a human feel. He did not lash out. He did not call security or press charges. He folded the damp photograph carefully, and with a steady hand I would later try to understand, produced a small bundle from his inner coat pocket. 3 envelopes, old papered and sealed, the wax barely visible through the folds. "I brought these," he said. "They were for you." He looked at me as he said it. For a moment I imagined he was addressing the room, but then I realized the gaze was landing on me like a compass. In that look was an awful kindness. "These are the letters," he continued slowly. "Helena made me promise that if the company ever seemed to forget, I should come back and test, quietly, without name. If the test failed, then the last letter should be opened. If they passed, then she said they'd do right by the people who make this place more than margins." He set the envelopes on the low table between him and the guard. They were marked with 3 dates, one long ago, one in the middle, one with today's handwriting.
"This is not about revenge," he said. "It is about remembering our promise." Someone, a junior associate, probably the one who'd been too young to have heard stories about the founders, mumbled, "Is he serious? Is he the founder?" The lobby erupted, not into violence, but into 1,000 different small astonishments. Phones came up, security straightened. The chauffeur from the car across the street actually walked in, and when he saw the wet man and the envelopes, his mouth made a tiny, uncertain circle. He called out, "Sir? Mr. Andrade?" The name again. A woman from the archives, one of those part-time folk who knew their boxes like prayer books, moved forward, squinting at the photographs. She took a breath, and then, with hands that trembled, she picked up the old framed picture hanging in the lobby, the one they'd never thought to change because it had been there so long. A younger Benedito with Helena at a ribbon cutting, the two of them smiling into a future they seemed to believe in. "That's him," she said. "That's him, right there." The framed image was a relic of a company's origin story. Dust on the frame, the logo older, the fonts like architecture. Helena was young in it, her nurse's uniform bright and earnest. Benedito, younger, had hair and a jaw that had not been worn down by decades. It was a photograph of beginning. I remember the way my own voice cracked when I asked, stupidly, "But why now? Why come in like this?" He smiled again, the smile of someone who'd given a long time to thinking about the right timing of things. She wanted me to see if the soul of this place remained. She thought being unnoticed would show what we truly valued. He unfolded one envelope then, the one without today's date. The paper was brittle, but the ink still readable. He read 2 lines aloud, not dramatically, but quietly, so that everyone there heard it as if we were in a room alone. "If they have not forgotten the small ones, then they have not forgotten us. If they have, then let us begin to make a place that remembers." The meaning of the words spilled into the room like the extra water on the floor. Simple, unavoidable. I felt like a child whose misdeed had been noticed by its parent, and then explained in plain terms I could not argue with. A security manager who had been doing his job all morning and who thrived on authority went paper white. "We need to verify," he started, but he didn't finish. The lobby had rearranged itself. Some lines of power had been turned into questions. Benedito then did something that required a particular kind of trust and a kind of theatrical calm only people who have nothing to prove can do. He took from his pocket a small card, an old appointment letter from the company's early days. It had his name on it, the signature of a board that no longer sat the same, and contact information. He unfolded it for us to see. It was a breadcrumb from the past, threaded into the present. Someone from legal, who by some providence had been standing at the edge of the crowd, took the letter and scanned it, the speed of a person who had spent her career making paperwork into fact. A few keystrokes, a look at a secure database, and then a name popped up in an internal directory marked with notes and dates. Founder, benefactor, legacy. It became real quickly, faster than I had wished. The lobby's hierarchy tilted toward recognition. Mr. Andrade, the man we'd treated like a trespasser, stood there, holding the evidence of his own life. He looked at me again, and, with no flourish, handed me the third envelope, the one that had arrived for today. My name wasn't on it, but I knew it would be the one he'd meant for leadership. I had been the loudest voice calling for order. I had been the one who thought I knew how to protect. "Read it," he said. The envelope opened under my fingers like an answer to a question I had not asked. The paper inside was simple, and not at all ceremonial. A letter written in a hand that had become slower over the years, the ink still dark in places. I did not have to read it silently. It wanted to be heard. "To the people who hold this company now," Benedito began, his voice steady. "My wife asked me before she died to do one thing. She told me to return when the world had grown hard and ask, 'Do you still remember the reason we gathered you here? Are you keeping the promises we built on? If the answers are yes, then you will have done right. If the answers are no, then the remedy must be both public and structural.' She knew sentiment without structure fades. She asked that if the company failed this test, that a plan be offered, so that the company might be saved from itself." He handed me a stack of pages. The first page was narrative, a quick sketch of Helena's life and the early days of the company. The next pages listed concrete initiatives, the things that would make remembering more than nostalgia. I read them aloud because I could not hold them in my mouth, and they shook when I spoke. The list was not sentimental. It was practical. It was designed to make memory measurable. Establish a Helena Memorial Council with at least 40% representation from frontline staff and retirees, I read. Create a hardship fund, seeded by company and private donor money, to support employees in crisis. Implement a quarterly leadership on the floor program, requiring executives to spend one full workday each quarter, working in entry-level positions across departments. Start a monthly shared meal across levels, where staff and leadership sit together without talking points. Create a dignity in work training and a permanent endowment for it. Audit hiring, payroll, and promotions for bias, and publish a progress report annually. The pages went on.
There were metrics suggested, not as prescriptions, but as markers: employee satisfaction measured transparently, turnover comparisons, the cost of living supplements, designated support for employees with long service. There were names of programs to be created, committees to be formed, deadlines proposed. The final page, handwritten in a different ink, was a conditional offer. "If you accept this," Helena's handwriting, the letter was in her hand, began, "then do so publicly. Apologize where you must. Replace leaders who cannot undertake the work. Make the plan permanent. If they refuse, then the fund will be used to create an independent trust to steward these reforms." Hearing her voice, ink on paper, was a strange thing. Paper that had once been private now commanded the center of a corporate foyer. The idea of apology in the same sentence as replace leaders made the air case differently. It wasn't only about sentiment, it was about accountability. The lobby, the auditorium, the polished corridors, everything that had long been organized to hide discomfort had been rearranged by something smaller than a scandal and bigger than a memo. We had been given a choice, in public, with a plan attached to it. I can remember the sound my own heartbeat made when I realized what this meant. It was one thing to be embarrassed by a gaffe, another to find one's job tied to a moral decision with consequences. Executives who had been fluent in the language of risk were suddenly translating words like apology and replace into potential reputational costs and boardroom recalculations. They made calculations aloud: shareholder reaction, audit risk, media statements. It was the dark algebra of power. Benedito waited, patient and undermining in the calmest possible way, for us to speak. He had an unthreatening dignity that, once recognized, made pretense feel grotesque. I heard myself before I could stop it. My apology was the thing of which I have been most ashamed and most grateful. Immediate, clumsy, human. "I'm sorry," I said, more to myself than to him. The lobby heard it as if a small, necessary thing had been said out loud. "I'm sorry for the way we treated you. I'm sorry for how we treat people who aren't convenient." My voice cracked. It was an admission the room needed, and probably deserved. People looked at me with puzzled, shifting faces.
some suspicious of its truth, some visibly relieved that someone had said what they'd been thinking but were too frightened to admit. I realized with the horrible clarity of someone who finally understands their reflection that I'd been protecting an image long after its cost to other people became unbearable. Benedito nodded, and then he did something that both startled and steadied the room. He forgave in a way that asked for something more than absolution. "I am not here for revenge," he said. "I am here to see if you will be trustees of what you inherited. Promises have a cost."
They require structures to maintain them. If you choose to accept the plan, then you must accept that it will be public and binding. If you refuse, the trust will see to it that those obligations are met regardless. That was the test, not whether we recognized fault, but whether we were prepared to make institutional amends. He wasn't asking for our contrition alone. He wanted a commitment to change, with tools attached, committees, funds, public metrics. There was an intake of breath, like someone drawing a net under a falling object. Leonardo, who had been the most strident in calling for boundaries, had the pallor of a man who had realized his conduct had been recorded in a ledger he hadn't seen before. He asked, on impulse, "What would you have us do first?" That question moved the air from accusation to action. Benedito set the envelopes aside, and with a man who had known strategy as the work of a lifetime, he said, "Begin with acknowledgement. Issue apologies, form the council, seed the hardship fund from the board until you can create public accountability, and promise me you'll publish a review in 6 months. If you choose to do nothing, then understand this. My wife's will has provisions to set these actions independent of the company. She wanted a chance for the company to choose." The proposal was precise and unthreatening. It framed adoption as the company's best route out of a moral and public accountability hazard. To the board, and to my private terror, adoption meant reputation risk and real expense. To workers, it meant recognition and help. To me, it meant losing faces of people I had sat with in meetings and trusted to do the unglamorous tasks of corporate life. But to decline the plan meant having someone else, chosen in the end by Helena's arrangements, decide what should be done. Minutes that might have been taken up by legalese became a moral accounting. We moved faster than I expected. Perhaps the public nature of the moment made it necessary. Perhaps it was the weight of the photograph, the wet cloth of memory. I found my hands shaking as I signed a small paper in the reception area, an immediate interim acknowledgement we drafted on the spot. "We apologize," it read, and beneath it a list of steps we'd committed, in broad terms, to pursue immediately. A public apology, formation of the Helena Memorial Council, immediate seed funding for the hardship account, and a public commitment to report back in 6 months. The paper felt both libation and liability. We printed copies. Someone took photographs for the press release that would later be edited for tone. The language was careful, but the action had a clarity that felt like healing. Benedito watched us. The wetness in his hair caught the light. He said nothing about vengeance. He said nothing unkind about me personally. He spoke of promises, structure, and memory. In his voice I heard the cadence of someone who had been careful with the small things for a lifetime.
"We will hold you accountable," he said then, "not as a threat, but as a covenant. Not to shame, but to make the change real." We did not have the courage to enact everything he proposed that day. The board convened within 48 hours. Lawyers lingered. Shareholders fretted. There were calls and memos and a scheduled press statement. But the seed had been planted. In the days that followed, the company published an apology, acknowledging mistakes in how guests were treated, and announcing the formation of the Helena Memorial Council, a hardship fund with initial board seating, and a plan for executive time on the floor. The first meeting of the council was an awkward and beautiful thing. Benedito sat at the table with retirees who cried when they were introduced, with a junior nurse who had worked with Helena decades ago, and with a group of frontline staff who had spent long careers fixing things without being thanked. I was there too, smaller than I had thought possible. We started with the names. People who had worked for a lifetime and left were read aloud and promised recognition. A plaque was drafted. Policies were written that had teeth, rules about quarterly executive service, funding commitments, and a public dashboard to report the metrics Helena had insisted upon. There was resistance. There were meetings where people kept asking about ROI, and where I had to answer honestly that the first returns were intangible, changed morale, a more humane daily rhythm. But there were also small wins that made the change feel like something that actually mattered. A nurse who had not had health coverage adequate for a long illness got emergency help from the hardship fund. An elderly records clerk who had been living on savings
received an offer of paid part-time work to supplement her income. An employee with years of service, whose name appeared on the list Benedito had left, was given a small ceremony with a bouquet and a medal, and was wept over by staff who had worked next to her for decades. People who had been invisible were visible now. One of the most meaningful reforms was the Leadership on the Floor program. I resisted it at first. Executives in scrubs. The idea felt performative to my ears. But when I spent a day in customer service, answering phones and helping a tired intern file paperwork, the experience was humbling in ways no boardroom could simulate. The proper gift of that program was not empathy as a soft feeling, but empathy translated into process. When leaders work where the work is done, they see what budgets and charts hide. We also instituted the monthly shared meal. At first it was awkward. Board members sitting with frontline staff at the long tables in the cafeteria, forks clicking in a new rhythm. People were embarrassed. There were jokes.
But the third time, someone told a story about a nurse who had once stitched extra blankets into packs for patients, and someone else remembered a payday when a young intern was given a few extra dollars for a cab. The stories changed the culture bit by bit. I confess that the deepest part of my repentance was private. Public apologies are their own currency, but what truly altered me was the slow, grinding work of undoing habits. I stopped leaning on the things I thought made me look important. I began to sit at the cafeteria table without rehearsed lines. I called people by their names and tried, often clumsily, to make space in my calendar for listening that went beyond checkboxes. Camilla, who had the courage to touch my sleeve the day of the water, became my most direct conscience. She would text short, honest notes. "Did you speak to Miss Alvarez today?" Or, "Have you checked on Joaquin's schedule?" She would not let me off the hook. It was painful and necessary. There were blowbacks. Some executives resigned rather than be part of the changes. Others fought the criteria for replacement and delay. We negotiated hard with the board about the seed funding and the way the hardship fund would be administered. There were lawsuits threatened by stakeholders who called the reforms expensive and symbolic. We navigated legalities, negotiated public statements, and learned to measure things we had not thought to measure before. And we measured results, carefully and with humility. The first quarter after the initial reforms reported a measurable increase in employee satisfaction, a reported uptick in the low 30s% range in internal surveys where morale had long been stagnant. Turnover decreased in departments where executives had done time on the floor. Productivity, measured across the operations units that had been subject to executive auditing, showed improvements the consultants called modest but consistent, small enough to be credible, large enough to be meaningful. To those who insisted the reforms would drain profit, the numbers were a rebuke. Higher retention reduced recruiting costs, fewer errors in operations meant fewer costly client corrections, and the public recognition improved brand sentiment in a part of the market that began to value human-centered corporate practices. We did not become a charity. We became a company that accepted the reality that dignity and efficiency are not mutually exclusive. They can be in relationship. The Helena Memorial Council became a permanent body. The plaque was installed in the lobby, near the place where the photograph had fallen and been dredged. The inscription named Helena, told in 2 sentences why the company existed, and included beneath it a list of the initial programs created in her honor. The plaque was not grandiose. It was the size of a hand and placed low enough that someone could touch it. People would pause there for a second now when they entered.
Some investors who had initially balked at the cost of the reforms stayed because the risk-reward calculus began to look different. A loyal workforce produced more consistent results, fewer legal exposures, and a brand that attracted certain kinds of clients. I don't tell these things to boast. I tell them because the change mattered in ways a spreadsheet can't fully capture. We made mistakes. We implemented poorly in places. Some programs required revision. But the general arc shifted from reflex to human dignity, from reflexive exclusion to intentional inclusion. And me? I still sometimes have dreams of leaning against lacquered steel, steady and self-assured. The dreams are shorter now. When they come, I wake up with a small shame that is steadier than panic. The first time I met Benedito after all the public measures were in place, he didn't speak about the water or the humiliation. He asked me instead, "Are you tired, child?" And when I said yes, he offered nothing but a very human cup of tea and a patient, unshaming smile. On the day we unveiled the Helena plaque, we invited everyone, retirees, maintenance crews, executives, volunteers. The chapel across the street was small and full. Benedito stood beside me at the front when we read the names aloud. He had a small, crumpled photograph of Helena in his hand, and the edges of it were softened by how much he touched it. When he turned to the crowd, there was a hush that felt like forgiveness, but was steadier,
like commitment. I wanted to know who keeps the small promises, he said, and that voice that used to be only for our records. Now that I've seen it, I want to help it last. There were no revolutionary speeches. There were no liturgical triumphs. There was a plaque, a council, a fund, and people who had stopped turning away. There was slowly a shared meal where people told the stories of how they'd survived this company and how they'd helped others survive it too. It was not a tidy miracle. It was a slow, human thing, the accumulation of small acts that, when multiplied, changed the weather. Sometimes when I am passing through the lobby, I pause by the plaque and touch the metal. It is cool. People look at me as if they are still surprised I could be tender, but tenderness is smaller than surprise and larger than any PR meeting. I do not accept any credit for the movement we made. I accept responsibility. The recognition is a different currency. If there's a final image that lives with me, it is not the Rolls Royce in the cold sunlight, but the photograph, damp, smudged, then dried and framed. I picture Helena's hands in that picture, busy and kind. I picture Benedito's patient steps and the courage it took him to come back. I picture the people who work here now, who are seen and sometimes paid better, sometimes heard in meetings where before they would have been given a form.
What changed the company was not merely the exposure of hypocrisy. It was the structure that turned remorse into redesign. Helena's promise was a tool, not a condemnation. It gave us options. We were called to choose dignity and then to build the systems to keep it. I tell this story because I want whoever is listening to understand how easily we hide cruelty behind logos. What changed the company was not merely the exposure of hypocrisy. It was the structure that turned remorse into redesign. Helena's promise was a tool, not a condemnation. It gave us options. We were called to choose dignity and then to build the systems to keep it. I tell this story because I want whoever is listening to understand how easily we hide cruelty behind logos and into procedure, how quickly we permit ourselves to flatten people into inconvenience, and because I want to confess, plainly, how easy it is to be the person who does the harming. I want to be honest about the little and great ways I shirked human obligation until confrontation forced my hand. There is a peculiar grace to being caught. It makes you choose differently if you let it. For me, the greatest mercy in that wet afternoon was the offer of a route out, not a cover-up, not a PR pivot, but structural repair. It required public truth, accountability, and a stubborn insistence that a company built by people should be run for people. Helena's test worked in the way she intended. It forced a living organization to make a choice under conditions it could not control. Some chose poorly at first. Those who chose differently later helped remake the place. Benedito did not demand revenge. He asked for a response that would become part of the company's architecture. Months later, when I pause at the plaque, when I see people who used to be invisible filling rooms and feeling steadier, I think of the Rolls Royce less and less. The car remains shiny at the curb sometimes, but it no longer holds the gravity it once did for me. If it chimes my ego, I try to remember the key fob on the marble and the cold wet that revealed more than it drenched. If this story touched you, if the idea that dignity and human decency can and should be part of how a business operates makes sense, then do one small thing with it. Share it with someone in a position to influence a workplace. We do not build cultures by accident. They are made by choices, by apologies, and by the stubborn work of turning remorse into systems that last. I treated him like trash until I realized he owned the Rolls Royce I was leaning on. I tell you this not to make myself small, but to say we are all capable of being better. The test came, and by grace and stubborn work, we answered it. Remember Helena. Remember the people whose names live in the margins. And when you have to make a choice, choose dignity.